on today's StoryBeat.
The trick is to always know what your next shot is. You don't have to know what your two shots from now are, but you have to know what your next shot is so that when you do say cut, check the gate, print, moving on, people know that you have the confidence to say, okay, the next shot is this one. Even if you're never even going to use that shot, you just, here's the dirty little secret. You just make up something just to buy yourself some time until you figure out what the real shot is.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today is filmmaker and author Dan Mirvish, whose recent feature, 18 and a Half, starred Willa Fitzgerald, John Magaro, and Bruce Campbell as the voice of Nixon. The award-winning film played in 25 festivals, had a 60-city theatrical release, played on 7 airlines, and is now available on Starz. Prior to that, Dan directed Bernard and Huey, scripted by Oscar and Pulitzer Prize winner Jules Feiffer. It starred Oscar winner Jim Rash and David Koechner. Dan's film Between Us, an adaptation of the hit Off-Broadway play, starred Julia Stiles, David Harbour, Taye Diggs, and Melissa George. He was mentored by the late, great Robert Altman on his first film, Omaha, the movie, which led him to co-found the upstart Slamdance Film Festival. And his film Open House prompted the Academy Awards to rewrite their rules on the Best Original Musical category. Dan co-wrote the critically acclaimed novel I Am Martin Eisenstat, and he wrote 2 editions and recorded an audiobook of his nonfiction book, The Cheerful Subversive's Guide to Independent Filmmaking. Dan is a graduate of USC's renowned film school and is a member of the Directors Guild of America. Of note, he's also worked as a U.S. Senate speechwriter. So for all those reasons and many more, it's a truly great pleasure for me to welcome the multi-talented Dan Mirvish to StoryBeat today. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's a great privilege for me to have you here, believe me. So let's go back in time just a little bit. How old were you when you first started to think about movies and theater and plays and writing and all these wonderful things?
Sure. Well, I was a senior in high school, and I got suckered into auditioning for the school play Fiddler on the Roof, and
suckered, were you?
Well, yeah, because my friends needed a ride home after auditions, and so they said, "Well, Dan, you're driving the carpool today, so if you stay and audition too, then we can get a ride home. They wouldn't have to take the bus."
Okay.
And so, yeah, thus became my theatrical career. That was also the beginning and pretty much the end of my acting career, which is probably just as well for all concerned. But anyway, that was but it was a lot of fun doing that. And then when I went to college the next year, I took a film class. I'd always been kind of interested in film, but growing up in Omaha, Nebraska, there wasn't really a consistent art house. There would be odd screenings here and there of interesting films. But then that first semester in college in St. Louis, I took a Super 8 class and really enjoyed that, and started through a poli-sci class, kind of dabbled a little bit in film theory stuff. But the school I went to, Washington University, didn't have a film program at all. So they, beyond that one Super 8 class. So, but I did realize I could take some summer classes at UCLA. So I did that. I took a couple cinematography classes at UCLA, which was great because it's a real film school, A
real school, yes.
Yeah, it smells like eucalyptus and opportunity. And, and I learned, and we had a really inspiring Czechoslovakian cinematographer there who was just great and taught me how to use 16 millimeter. And back in St. Louis, I was very involved with the student group that showed films every day on campus. And so because I knew how to use 16 millimeter, I was able to shoot like our Coming Soon and No Smoking trailers, things like that. So even though I majored in history and political science, I kept doing as much film as I could while I was there.
But you obviously eventually went to USC. That was for grad school, I assume.
Yeah, exactly. And then after college, I took the GREs thinking I might at some point go to film school, but then I sort of had the Washington bug a little bit. So I moved out to DC and worked a little bit as a journalist. And then, as you mentioned, worked as a speechwriter for Senator Tom Harkin.
Oh, for Tom Harkin.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
How long did you do that?
It was about a year and a half, you know. I realized if you stay in DC long enough, by the time you hit 30, someone gives you a three-piece suit and a law degree just by osmosis. And I was like, well, I'm not sure if I want that. So I thought I should apply to film school.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a moment. How was that experience? Because I've never talked to anyone that has been a Senate speechwriter or worked for a senator.
Yeah, and at the time there were not many of us that were designated speechwriters. Most Senate offices, just if you were like the farm aide, you would write the farm speeches, or the foreign policy aide, you'd write the foreign policy speech. We were one of the few offices that actually had two designated speechwriters, and a lot of what I was doing as initially as the junior speechwriter was supervising video shoots, because we would do if the Kiwanis Club in Des Moines needed a speech, this is in their like 1989, 1990, you would go to the basement of the Capitol where there are recording studios and video recording studios, and you'd record the senator giving a speech on a teleprompter, just basically speaking to camera. These were not creative videos of any, but we would do a lot of those, like once a week, do a whole round of those. But that sort of got me talking to the guys in the booth on a consistent basis and playing around with cameras a little bit, and just kind of seeing how, little videos are made. But that kind of kept my film interest going a little bit, and the guys in the booth would be like, yeah, you should go to film school, you should apply. But what was fun, and the kind of the relevant thing to that I later figured out was the relevant thing, was that it really taught you to write in the voice of a character, of somebody else. In this case, it was a real person who had a particular and unique speaking style, and to put your head into the head of someone else, and your voice coming out of their voice. I think that was really helpful then later in screenwriting.
Would Harkin vet the speeches?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. And I also learned while I was there, there are some senators who are, and other politicians who are very good at reading speeches and can make them feel like they are truly their own. Harkin was, and, still is, very good at that. He knew when to kind of improvise, when to go off script, and then how to come back in, which is not an easy thing to do, especially if there's a moving teleprompter or something like that, or even a written speech. He was very nimble at that, and a lot of politicians aren't. Yeah, it was very easy to write for him.
Your political experience in Washington said to you, I better go to Los Angeles and become a movie maker.
Exactly, yeah.
So you go to USC for grad school, right?
Yeah, for grad school, yeah, the graduate production program, yeah.
And how long was that? Was that 2 years?
It was a 3-year program, and or 3 to 5 for time off for good behavior. Not everybody finished in 3. And some people left early. A third of our class dropped out the first year, another third dropped out the second year. But I stuck with it, and then I was able to find the one loophole where I could actually do a full-length feature as my thesis film. No one had ever done that before. But this was, early 90s. This was when Richard Linklater, Robert Rodriguez were making these little indie films in Texas. And I was like, well, I want to do that. I'm from Omaha. How hard can it be? And then the summer after my first year there, I really learned how to make a film from beginning to end, because wound up interning and getting hired on a kickboxing movie in the Philippines. The old adage, you learn more from working on a bad film than you do from working on a good film.
100%.
I learned a lot on that kickboxing movie. And but really was able to see a film getting made straight from pre-production and the writing stage through production and into post, which is kind of rare to get that full experience from beginning to end of a film. But that kind of gave me the confidence that then I wanted to do a feature-length thesis film, and then went back to wrote it for friends back in Nebraska, actor friends. Some of them had been in that first high school musical I was in. and locations back in Nebraska. And then we went back there, raised money, and then teamed up with the local producer. And coincidentally, his grandfather was Robert Altman. So I was like, yeah, that's cool.
Oh, well.
Yeah. So we had the great benefit of Robert Altman as our mentor on that.
And so what did you learn from him that has held you in good stead all these years?
Yeah, a couple key things. One, I mean, this was a thing he was known to say, and as other directors have, which is, 90% of directing is casting. It's taken me 30 years to figure out what the other 10% is, and I'm still figuring that out. But that was definitely something he adhered to and imparted to us. The other big thing from him was a couple things. Number one, really talking to him in depth about how and why he would record sound. He was known and was instrumental in sort of having actors, be lavaliered with individual lavalier mics, each actor going to a separate audio track. And it was really fascinating watching him do that. I was on the set of Kansas City for a few days and watched that. And the why of the process too. You get better performances from the actors, you never have ADR, but also he said, you're not relying on the lowest paid member of the crew, the boom operator, to make the creative decisions for you. He says, you're the artist, you're the director, you should be able to do that. And the only way to do that is record everyone and then make those decisions in post. And that was something I've kind of done in every film since then. But then the other big thing was sort of how you make these films production wise, which is to say you set a start date and you tell everyone the train's leaving the station and you're either on or you're off, and you just stick to that start date no matter what, and you cast and shoot the film with whoever you have.
Is that true even if you don't have all the financing?
Oh, it's even more so. Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think the practical lesson is, have enough financing to get through production one way or another, enough to pay your cast and crew and feed people. But you certainly don't need money for post-production up front, even much more so now than at the time.
Why is that?
Well, because worst case scenario, you can always edit the film on your laptop for free, assuming you know something about editing, which you ought to. So you can always cut a version of a film together. It may not be the finished version, you may not be able to do the final sound mix, but you can get pretty far these days just on a laptop.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's become a whole lot cheaper to make something akin to a professional looking movie these days.
Yeah, exactly. So, but getting through production, you still need money.
Well, obviously, if you're going to pay people anything, and you've got to feed them and sometimes transport them and sometimes house them and that sort of stuff.
Right.
So yes, that costs money, but it is a lot cheaper in terms of the footage itself, which is no longer in film. It's mostly in video, and that's relatively inexpensive by comparison.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you started back in the day when you were actually shooting on film.
Exactly. Yeah. My first film, we were, we shot on 35 millimeter, which meant using short ends that we would get, leftover footage from Hollywood. And
you have to realize nobody today that's in film school knows what short ends are.
I know. Yeah. It's crazy. It's basically, it's literally the leftover film. A big Hollywood production or a TV show would, if they're doing an 8-minute take, for example, for whatever reason, or they do 2 4-minute takes and they've got 2 minutes left over of footage, because they would come in these 9,000 or 10,000 foot cans, which would last 10 minutes, they would just save those last 2 minutes worth of film. And then there was this secondary market that developed where they would either give or donate or sell those extra little short ends to indie filmmakers. So then when we were making our films, we had to shoot on footage that was less than 2 minutes long. So I could never do a take that was longer than 2 minutes or longer than a minute and a half, which I think did influence the way I shoot my film sometimes. But that was how you would make films in the 90s, was with leftover footage. I mean, we got Beverly Hills 90210. God bless them. They gave us some of their short ends to help.
Well, I think in those days, it was still relatively challenging to shoot long takes because film is a much more cumbersome process. But if you have video today, you can shoot and shoot and shoot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, there's still a beauty to shooting on film, and on my last film, Bernard and Huey, we actually did shoot about 10% of it on 16 millimeter on Super 16. It's because we had some flashbacks, and that lent itself to it. And it was interesting going back and figuring out how to shoot on film again. Just the whole rhythm of the set is very different than a digital set. Everybody has to be really rehearsed, including all the crew, and where you put the slate and where you put the boom. You have someone mess that up, and you've got to shoot the whole thing over again.
So did you get to work with Jules Feiffer?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. He was, yeah, worked closely with him. I mean, he was in his late 80s when we started the production, but it took us a while. We kind of rediscovered this script, Bernard and Huey, that he had written in 1986, had been commissioned by Showtime to write it. And it's based on characters that actually go back to 1957 from his comic strips that had been The Village Voice and Playboy magazine. And then he'd been commissioned to write the script for Showtime. But the week he turned it in, they changed their ownership and their business model. And they said, we're not doing features anymore. So they never paid him for it. And then it basically disappeared for 30 years. And we tracked it down. I'd read this interview with him where he said he had several unproduced screenplays. And then I got in touch with him, and he couldn't remember what they were, and everything was in storage, and he'd been divorced so many times he couldn't find anything.
Oh,
anyway, then eventually I tracked down a copy of the script at the Academy Library. It had been published in a magazine, Scenario magazine, and in 1996 or something like that. And anyway, we found a copy, and Jules said, "Oh yeah, that's the one, Bernard and Huey." But that what you read may have been an abridged version. I said, "Well, let's find your old assistant. Maybe she has an old floppy disk of it." "No, she's dead." "Oh, well, that's regrettable." And I go, "What about your old agent?" "No, he is dead." "Well, all right. What about your old lawyer?" "No longer among the counted. He is dead." And so finally, we found an old producing partner of his who thankfully was still alive, still married, still had his archives, and he had a copy of the full script. And then we actually tracked down the original handwritten copy of the script on yellow legal pads at the Library of Congress.
Holy mackerel.
Jules had donated some of his work there. So, and then he's like, "I'm 87. When are we making this thing already?" So yeah, it was great working with him. And he had so many stories of working with Kubrick and Altman, and
He's one of the great comic geniuses of all time. I mean, really.
yeah. And for those who don't know, he was, as a screenwriter, he wrote Carnal Knowledge and worked with Alan Arkin on Little Murders, but of course had this comic strip that he won the Pulitzer for, and worked with Mike Nichols and Elaine May, and yeah, I mean, he's just an incredible guy. So
Well, that's amazing that you were able to not only contact him, but actually start to work with him. Because at that point, why would he bother with someone he doesn't really know,
exactly. Well, I bribed him with bagels and lox from New York.
Is that all it takes?
Apparently, yeah. Yeah,
I got to remember
no,
that.
that's the trick, is you have to find the soft spot for anyone that you're working with. Yeah.
So what attracts you to stories? I know that you have a little bit of a political bent. You obviously have a poli-sci background and history. Is that what attracts you, is things that have some kind of a political undertone to them?
I think more so recently. Yeah, definitely. That's kind of what largely attracted me to coming up with 18 and a half, the last film we did.
Tell us about it. What is 18 and a half?
Yeah, 18 and a half, which kind of evolved out of conversations with Feiffer, kind of as we were finishing up Bernard and Huey. It's fictional, historical fiction. It's about the missing 18 and a half minute gap in the Nixon Watergate tapes. And it's about a young woman who works in the Nixon White House as a transcriber, who gets a hold, stumbles into the missing 18 and a half minute gap and wants to leak it to a reporter. And they meet at a seaside motel, and naturally run afoul of hippie swingers and nefarious people out to get them.
Naturally.
As one does. So it all takes place in 1974, and it was really inspired in large part because my friend Terry Keefe, who had been an indie film producer, but had kind of inherited a motel in Greenport, New York, on the tip of Long Island, that was a vintage-looking motel that his grandparents had built in the 50s and 60s, and kind of stopped renovating it in around 1974. And he had really done a great job preserving the vintage look and feel of it. And it had been used, I mean, it was a real working motel at the time, but had been used as a location for music videos and commercials and that sort of thing, but no one had ever shot a feature there. And Terry was actually with me talking to Jules, because this was on the tip of Long Island. Jules lived on Shelter Island at the time. We had just taken the ferry back and forth. And it was the day after Trump got elected in 2016. And so the conversation that the three of us were having was very much comparisons between Trump and Nixon. And because Feiffer was, he won the Pulitzer for his Nixon cartoons, essentially. And so, we were like, well, how many impeachments could we possibly have in the next 4 years? And then with that kind of in the back of our minds, Terry and I went back to his motel, and I was like, oh my God, this looks like 1974. Let's make a Watergate film. But it didn't look like the Watergate hotel. It looked like a seaside motel. So the trick and the challenge was, first of all, we figured out, well, okay, we'll just tell people it's in Maryland. That's on the Chesapeake, and that's at least geographically closer to Washington. But then crafting a story that would work with that location, because Terry said, hey, if we shoot it, we can, he was closed in the winter, we can have the whole cast and crew stay there. And then we teamed up with a writing partner of mine, Daniel Moya, and coincidentally, he had an aunt and uncle who owned a period-looking diner that was just down the street from Terry's motel. And so now we had two locations. Now you got two locations. The film gods say the rule is you have to make the movie. So then it was a matter of just kind of coming up with interesting and compelling characters that we could stick in this world. Because the hard part is for indie filmmakers, especially, people always say, oh my God, don't do a period film. It's so expensive. It's so challenging. It's never going to look right. And really that experience with Bernard and Huey, shooting some of the flashbacks in even though we were shooting in film, it kind of demystified making a period film for me. So we're like, yeah, let's just embrace it. And
so you took a well-known era and lots of characters that were well-known, mm-hmm. and put it into a completely whole cloth original work.
Yeah, exactly. And really most of the main characters are all fictional characters, but at some point they do listen to our version of the 18.5-minute gap. And so we had Bruce Campbell as Nixon, as the voice of Nixon. So we had to cast people as known entities. So Bruce as Nixon, John Cryer as Haldeman, his first chief of staff, and then Ted Ramey as General Al Haig, who was Nixon's second chief of staff. And then all the live action characters are all fictional.
When you're dealing with famous people like that, you don't really need to clear anything, do you?
No. If they're the secret is if they're dead.
If they're dead.
If they're dead, that's the surest bet at all. The other thing is if they're a public figure, then you're pretty much you have pretty much free reign as well. But if they're a public figure and they're dead and it's a comedy, you can do whatever you want.
I assume if someone's alive and a public figure, you still have to avoid slandering them, yes?
Yeah, but it's harder to slander someone who's a public figure. So the slanderer has a lot more protection, First Amendment protection.
Did your time working for Tom Harkin help you in terms of the story, did it help you with that story?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I knew even before I met Harkin, when I was in college, one of my professors and mentors was former Senator Thomas Eagleton, who had just retired and was then teaching. And he had been McGovern's running mate until he got kicked off the ticket, which may or may not have come out of Nixon's shenanigans. So sort of having known him, and then Harkin was the Watergate class or the post-Watergate class, and he got elected in 1974 to the House. And just sort of being in Washington, and you would run into these tangential figures to Watergate. I think Elliot Richardson I spoke to on the phone briefly once, but also a big part of the plot of the story and the characters really is that they are these young 20-something people caught up in this bigger world. And that was something that I experienced firsthand, being a 20-something person in Washington, that you're like, because people forget that most of Washington is really run by 20-year-olds,
I didn't know that it's run by 20-year-olds because they're all pages and assistants and so on.
and assistants and interns and young staffers. And it was interesting then when the January 6 hearings came out. This is now after we shot the film, and Cassidy Hutchinson became the big witness. And we were like, oh my gosh, that is just like our character. You know, somebody literally, she almost looks like Willa Fitzgerald, who plays our character, but a young 20-something woman working in the White House who nobody else is paying attention to, but has access to great information and power that could potentially bring down a president. And we were like, that thematically, at least, is right on the money for what our film was.
All right, so let's talk about your process a little bit in terms of when you're making the movie.
Sure.
You've obviously sat down, you came up with a story, you sat down and wrote the story. I'm just curious, have you ever worked on someone else's script? I guess Jules Feiffer counts.
Well, the Feiffer one, yeah. I mean, there was a little bit of tweaking that we did because we had to adjust the era up 30 years because originally it was written contemporaneously in 1986 with flashbacks to 1960. And so we moved everything up 30 years. So it was, 2017 were the contemporary scenes, and then 1988 was the flashback scenes. And what was interesting was how little work. I mean, and Jules kind of gave me free rein to kind of tweak it just to get the periods right. But remarkably, it didn't really need that much work to do. There was just a few references, but plot-wise, it actually worked remarkably well.
So, all right, you have a script, and you have decided you want to make this script into a movie.
Yeah.
Where do you start? What's the first thing that you do? Do you decide that you're going to cast it before you, obviously you need money, so you've somehow figured out to get some kind of money.
Well, yeah, so that is the interesting chicken and egg that most people wrestle with is you can't get the money until you get the cast. You can't get the cast without the money. And the way you kind of break that conundrum is through crowdfunding largely. So on most of my films, I've done some version of crowdfunding. I've used Kickstarter a few times, Seed and Spark, and the reason for that is because it is cast agnostic financing. That's ideally what you want to start with, is anything that's cast agnostic financing, whether that's your family or your friends or a formal campaign, because those are the people that are giving you money because they believe in you, they believe in the script, they believe in giving away their money for whatever reason. And then once you have a little bit of that, you don't need the full budget. But if you have, 10 or 15% of the budget through crowdfunding or other cast agnostic financing, that gives you then the confidence to set a start date. And that goes to what I mentioned Altman would say, is set that start date and tell everyone you're making the movie and train's leaving the station. And then it's much easier to then cast other people in the film, because actors and their agents, more importantly, are motivated by two things. One is money, but the other thing is insecurity. And so they abhor a vacuum in their schedule. Actors love to act. Certainly the good ones do. And agents love to book their actors in something, anything, just anything to keep them from bothering them and calling them on the phone. When's my next gig? When's my next gig? So if you have a firm start date, even if your budget's super low, and as long as the parts are interesting and compelling, parts for the actors, you'll find a good cast. You don't always know until the day before you're shooting, or even sometimes the day of shooting, who you're going to get, but you'll get someone, and you'll get someone good.
That sounds nerve-wracking to me.
It's incredibly nerve-wracking. On 18 and a half, for example, we started the first week of shooting with our two main actors, Willa Fitzgerald and John Magaro, who are both great. But the second week of shooting, we were going to have introduced two new characters, kind of our second two leads. And we were well into that first week, 3 or 4 days in, and we had no idea who was going to show up the next week because someone had dropped out. And so we were scrambling around, and then in the end, we got two amazing actors, Vondi Curtis Hall and Kathy Curtin, and they were terrific. And we got lucky, I think.
All right, so you now have a script, and you have something akin to a green light. You may not have all of your budget, and you may not have all of your actors. You at least have a crew lined up.
Yeah, that's helpful.
I would say that's very helpful.
Yeah, at least for the first week. You should have your crew lined up. You can,
But
once you get into the second week, you can get new crew.
how do you break your script down before you even get into production? What do you do to break your script down?
Well, I try to aim for ones that getting locations is actually the hardest thing, I think, on making these indie films, because it's the one variable that can either be really free, like my friend Terry, who essentially gave us this great location, which was great. And then we wrote the script around the location. So that's great when that happens. Or they can wind up being very expensive. And you don't always know that until sometimes after you've shot there, when you realize, oh, hey, hang on a second, your crew scratched our floor and now it's going to cost an extra $10,000, or you didn't get the right permit from the right city and, that's an extra $10,000. So that is the biggest variable, really, because with cast, you're dealing with SAG scale, whichever, you pick whatever scale you're at, and with crew, you're typically working with minimum wage. So those are and how much it costs to feed X number of people, X number of meals.
Sure.
But locations tend to be the biggest unknown. Yeah. So, which then, to answer your question, I mean, I'm always thinking about location when I'm reading it.
So do you try to make scripts, write scripts, find scripts that are minimalized on terms of location or special effects or that kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. But on the other hand, you also shouldn't be afraid of things too. So, for example, in Bernard and Huey, the Feiffer script, there's a short scene in there that and it's one of our flashback scenes. So it takes place on a New York City subway from 1988. And we were shooting most of the film in Los Angeles. So how do you find a New York City subway in 1988? We're kind of racking our brains. And then finally, I had been watching Panic in Needle Park from 1972. That it's Al Pacino's first breakout film. But the opening shot of that is a woman in the film. I forget her name, but it's kind of a close up of her on a New York City subway that they really shot on New York City subway in 1972. And then just kind of holding a pole and surrounded by a bunch of people. And I realized all you need to sell a New York City subway is a pole and a bunch of other people. And so we wound up shooting it in my garage in Culver City in LA, with one pole and all of our crew just jammed up next to our main characters. And, with lights and sound and sound design, we sold it. Everybody thinks we shot that on a subway. So on the one hand, you need to be very cognizant of locations. On the other hand, you also can be creative about them too, and not be afraid of locations. And same thing with visual effects now, because there are so many inexpensive ways to do visual effects, if you need to. I mean, most of my films don't have a lot of visual effects, but every now and again, there's a couple little things that we have to clean up or change or do, and it's not that expensive.
There are lots of packages that help with that now, video packages of one kind or another.
Yeah. But we had on 18½, we had a great little team. I mean, one guy was our effects supervisor, was my neighbor, but he was kind of between Marvel projects, and and this was at the height of the pandemic, so I would trade sourdough for effects shots, and he had a couple guys in Guadalajara and Mexico that were sitting around with nothing to do, and they would work on these shots.
And you're saying the guys in Guadalajara and Mexico liked sourdough?
Well, no, the guy who lived near me, he liked sourdough. He was Colombian, but he liked the sourdough. I feel bad. The guys in Guadalajara never got the sourdough, so I'm not really sure how that
They got ripped off.
They did, yeah.
So do you continue to work on the script in production? Do you allow the actors to do what they feel like they're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, there's the old adage that you write a script 3 times, and in the screenplay form, and then while you're directing on set, and then in post-production as well. I think that adage is true. So the way I like to work, and it's been a little different on each film depending on the circumstances, I like to do rehearsal when we have the time, but on 18½, we didn't have the time because we were getting the actors at the last minute, so we made that work for us. But yeah, I really like to trust my actors, and I make a point of hiring smart actors who are good filmmakers themselves usually. In the case of Bernard and Huey, we had Jim Rash as one of the leads, who's Oscar-winning screenwriter, and I would say, hey, Oscar, do you want to rewrite this thing or improvise? And, thankfully, Feiffer himself came from a bit of an improv background at Second City, working with Nichols and May. So he didn't mind that we were doing that. And yeah, really letting the actors, make the words feel natural to them, with whatever kind of improvisation that takes, either on set or in rehearsal.
Are you a very well-planned person going into production, or are you more freeform?
Oh, I would say more freeform. So
More freeform.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I don't do a lot of storyboarding, except when there's like an action sequence, or we have one last day and we have to get this element and this shot and we're trying to fill in gaps from what we've already edited. But no, I tend not to be overly planned.
Do you ever get stumped?
Yes, I do.
And what do you do? How do you solve that?
The trick is to always know what your next shot is. You don't have to know what your two shots from now are, but you have to know what your next shot is, so that when you do say cut, check the gate, print, moving on, people know that you have the confidence to say, okay, the next shot is this one. Even if you're never even going to use that shot, you just, here's the dirty little secret. You just make up something just to buy yourself some time until you figure out what the real shot is that you really want.
Wow, I've never heard anybody say that before.
Yeah, well, no one will admit it, but yeah, because as long as you can keep the crew and the cast moving around and thinking that they're creating great art, that's the important thing. As soon as they're like standing around twiddling their thumbs, that's when it's a real problem. Yeah.
Oh, that's a huge problem. Everybody knows time is money on a set, and
exactly,
you're really burning it.
It's always better to shoot something than to be wondering what you're going to shoot. The challenge is when there are these other circumstances, like, oh, a cloud just came over, or it started raining, or we're losing, or a neighbor starts their, leaf blower or something like that. And then you've got to figure out, but there's always a way to shoot something, and when in doubt, just shoot something.
Most people that I know that direct are pretty well planned out so that they can figure out how to make a pivot when they have to, or punt when they have to. But you go at it freeform. Do you find that to be stimulating in some ways, that like really get your juices flowing?
Well, it always drives the first AD crazy, and the rest.
No kidding.
But yeah. So no, the trick is to have a plan. To have some kind of a shot list at least going in, or know, okay, tomorrow we're at this location, so therefore we have to shoot this scene because we're going to lose our location the next day. And that really will force you to get those scenes done. So the trick is really then in working with the individual actors, or the team of actors. And this is one reason I like to do rehearsal. And this is another little secret too that I think not too many people know about, is that once you've either rehearsed or shot a few days of footage and you've started to work with the actors, you can kind of tell which pairs or teams of actors are really good together in terms of chemistry and pacing, and know their lines. And so if you see that there's a team of 2 actors or 3 actors that are really, you're like, oh, wow, these guys are all on the same wavelength, I can probably then shoot oneers with them, shoot longer takes with them. As opposed to if there's 2 or 3 or 4 actors and one's struggling with their lines, or just one has a slower pacing to their rhythm of speaking, and one has a faster pacing, or you just cast someone late in the game and so they just don't know, they haven't had time to memorize all their lines, then you have to think, okay, I'm going to shoot them in a different style. I'm going to shoot them more with traditional coverage or a jump cutting style or something like that. So I think that's something that's unique that I do, is I pay attention to the actors that we have and play to their strengths. So you're not forcing someone to do a long shot and it's 2 actors and their rhythm is just never going to be perfect, or they can't remember their lines or something like that. And you're all getting frustrated that, oh my gosh, this is not going to work in this long shot. It's like, no, just shoot it in a different style and then you don't have that problem. Whereas if you've got two actors and they can sustain a long 5-minute oneer, then shoot it in a long 5-minute oneer. It's not about showing off, for your film school friends. It's about taking advantage of the actors and the team that you have. And likewise with the crew, if you've got a first assistant camera who's not good at holding focus or not good at racking focus, in the middle of a shot, but they're good at holding, then you adjust your style to that, I don't know, something like that, or a boom operator who can't hold a boom for more than 3 minutes because, they have a sprained shoulder.
It's hard to do. It's hard to do.
Yeah.
So you're saying that your philosophy and your technique in terms of the crew and actors and so on is to sort of go to their strengths.
Exactly.
Not to have them try to come to your vision.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, it would be great if everybody came to my vision and did exactly what I wanted. I just know that on an indie film, I don't have the budget to pay for everybody that I want, to build the sets that I absolutely want, to cast all the actors that I absolutely want, all at the same time. I know that's never going to happen at a, when you're making a film for a couple $100,000 or something. So, okay, but you can still make a film and there are ways to do it. So the way to do it is you play to the strengths of the people you do have.
Mm-hmm. I think that's quite wise. Do you ever run into, and you don't need to mention any names, but do you ever run into an issue where the acting just isn't there? How do you solve that?
Yes, you find a way to film the reactions of the other actors.
Wow.
And part of it is also because I do a lot of my own editing. On 18 and a half, I was my own editor. On all my other films, I've at least edited at least part of the movie. That's the other thing too, is knowing how you're going to edit a scene, or knowing the ways that you can edit a scene. You're like, you know what? If this one extra who just has 3 lines, if they're not perfect, that's fine. We'll just play the scene off of the other actors and it'll just be audio. And I know if they've got weird pauses or something, I know I can change that, in post, and I know how to do it, with audio editing.
Can you sense that as you're on the set while you're shooting?
Yeah.
Hey, I know I'm going to have to work this in post.
But yeah, again, goes to the idea of sort of being flexible in the way you're going to shoot a scene and the way you're going to do coverage based on the elements that you have. So exactly, if you have one actor and they show up and you're like, oh my gosh, they just have a weird timing to their phrasing, or they're, singing to the rafters, or whatever it is they're doing that's not quite consistent with everything else you're doing, you need to know, okay, how do I shoot that in a way that we can move forward and we're not wasting a lot of time, changing an actor who can't be changed, or changing the position of the sun that can't be changed, or, whatever that element is that you can't change, you just need to adapt to it.
So there's a big theme going on in here about you being flexible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
As opposed to being, no, this is my way or the highway.
No, I mean, look, if I had an unlimited budget, I could do that, and unlimited time, but I know that we never do. I mean, these films are made in 15 days. You have to shoot 10 pages a day, and you're never going to get through that if you were waiting for the perfect take. That's the other thing, that the lesson from Altman when he was talking about sound, and knowing that you could get overlapping dialogue, but the real advantage of that is then as a director, you can make those choices in post-production. I take that and apply it also now to the visual side. So for example, the nice thing about shooting digitally these days is that you can shoot on 4K and finish in 2K, or shoot on 6K or 8K now and finish on 4K, whatever it is, it changes every year. What that allows you to do is, if you don't get the perfect framing, because that's another thing, that you're trusting your operator to get the perfect framing every time. Well, you're not going to get the perfect frame and exact framing every time. But if you know that you're shooting at 6K and you're finishing in 4K, you also know that in editing, you can move things around. You can do a little bit of panning and scanning and zooming, and it'll be fine. And so, great, 3 takes in, we're done. Oh, was I bumped the framing a little bit. Don't worry about it. we will adjust it in post, and that's fine. And everybody has to kind of know that that is what the plan is. Your DP has to know that going in.
And you can easily do things like undercrank and overcrank, and easily in post you can do it. You can speed up and slow down.
Yeah, well, that's not something I do because that still isn't going to look great. But in theory, yeah, it is easier to do that now than.
It's certainly easier to color correct in post.
Oh, color correct, yeah, for sure. Although, but even then, I see a lot of new filmmakers who are like, "Oh, we can just completely change everything in color." And the problem is you can't. Now, technically, you probably can, but in reality, you're paying your colorist for an X number of days, and it's maybe only 7 days or 5 days or whatever it is. So the kinds of things you could do on a 30-second commercial, for example, you get DPs who are like, "Oh, I can change anything in a 30-second spot." It's like, this isn't a commercial. This is a feature, and we have to pay our colorist. So in other words, get the color right as best as you can in production. As you say, but if there's one thing that you're like, "Oh my gosh, we're 3 takes in and we realize this one window is too hot in the background." Yeah, that's something that you're like, you know what, we can change that in post. So let's move on.
Tell us about the book.
It's really about how to shoot an indie film from beginning to end. And it's, I had been writing a number of articles mainly for Filmmaker magazine, as well as some other places over the years. And then I realized I kind of had enough it turned out to be half a book. And so then I had to keep writing more. But it really is kind of all these lessons that I've learned from other filmmakers and co-founder of Slamdance. So from other Slamdance filmmakers, Christopher Nolan, the Russo brothers, Rian Johnson, people like that, all kind of shoved into this book. But it's jam-packed with real practical things, like how do you form an LLC? Where do you rent a camera? How do you do editing? How do you apply to film festivals? How do you get distribution? How do you do self-distribution? How do you do an awards campaign on no budget? And kind of all with the underlying theme that it is usually better to make the low budget film than to wait for years and years and years for all the circumstances to get perfect to make the big budget film, and then ultimately maybe never do that. And it's really kind of designed for people that have some background in film. Either they went to film school, they've done a number of shorts, and now they're trying to get their first feature off the ground, or maybe they've done one feature and they want to do a second one. And okay, well, great. Now, how do I get sort of A-list or B+ list actors in a micro budget film? And so it's kind of designed for folks like that. So the book, the publisher is Focal Press or Rutledge, and we've had 2 editions, and one of the editions was translated into Chinese by the dean of the Beijing Film Academy.
That's cool.
Which is pretty cool. Yeah. So
how did you then get to start Slamdance Film Festival in Park City, Utah?
In Park City, Utah. So we started because that first film I did, Omaha the movie, didn't get into Sundance, and this was at a time in mid '90s, which was kind of a pivotal time in independent film. It was right when Miramax had just become part of Disney, Fine Line become part of Warner Brothers, Fox was launching Fox Searchlight, and it was kind of the era of the Hollywoodization of independent film, and Sundance was like, woohoo, we're going on that Hollywood ride, and they started showing more films with bigger budgets and second-time directors and bigger stars and films that already had distribution, and hey, Harvey, come on in and do your horrible things. And so they kind of left behind the niche of the real first-time indie filmmaker. And it was also a time when there were a lot more films being made at that level. So I got together with a bunch of other filmmakers, and meanwhile, we had distributors telling us point blank, "Oh, we love your film, but we're not going to pick it up for distribution unless it gets into Sundance." So we realized we really had to be in Park City. We had to be there. That's where the distributors were. That's where people with checkbooks were. That's where the agents were. So yeah, showed up in Park City, Utah. Literally, some of our screenings were 30 feet down the hall from some of Sundance's screenings. And we, set our start times for 15 minutes after theirs. And their overflow crowd just went into our screening rooms. And we'd been doing this that first year in January 95. And by the end of that week, we were like, I think we're onto something. I think we're kind of serving a niche here. So why don't we put down a credit card and reserve it for the next year? So we've been doing it for 30 years. We actually just last week announced that Next year, we're not going to be in Park City. We're going to
Oh,
do the whole festival in LA. Most of us are based in LA anyway, and we've done events in LA most years anyway. So it's not actually a huge change for as far as we're concerned, but yeah, for everyone else, it'll be a big change. And Sundance is possibly changing their venue in the next year or two anyway. So
where are they talking about going?
well, they've got bids out to I think 3 or 4 different places. I think New Mexico, Santa Fe is a possibility. Colorado is a possibility. San Francisco, maybe LA, or they may stay in Utah, but maybe not in Park City. That's something else that's been floated in the last week.
Somewhere warmer.
Well, hopefully somewhere that isn't as expensive, somewhere cheaper. That's the key problem for both Sundance and Slamdance and all the filmmakers and the press and everybody is to throw a film festival in the most expensive resort town in America is not a sustainable idea.
When you set up shop, did Sundance do anything to try and stop you?
They were not happy.
I can't imagine, because all of a sudden you're coming in and competing with them.
Yeah, no, they were not thrilled with that idea.
And you used the word dance in your title.
Yeah, Redford in an interview in '96 called us parasites, which was the best street cred we could ever get, by the way. And he's right, we were parasites, but I always like to liken it to we were the nice, pretty green moss on the old oak tree that just made the whole forest look nicer. So, but over the years, I mean, I think Sundance begrudgingly acknowledged that we were serving a purpose that they were not able to fulfill anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And over the years, we saw so many Slamdance filmmakers where we would show their first film, because our focus isn't still on first-time filmmakers, but then their second film would get into Sundance, and they would do particularly well there because they had experience being in Park City. You know, and I mentioned some of the alumni, but also Bong Joon-ho, the late Lynn Shelton, Lena Dunham, Gina Prince Bythewood, the Safdie brothers, Sean Baker. I mean, it's the list of Slamdance alumni is pretty impressive. And you haven't always heard of the film that they had at Slamdance, but you've heard of them.
Sure. How challenging is it to keep doing a festival every year? It's got to be really challenging.
It's very challenging. I think one of the key things and smartest things we did is we kind of instituted this policy every year that the programming for the new festival is largely done by alumni from the previous festival. So filmmakers one year are picking films for the next year. And so that has allowed kind of fresh voices every year and allowed the old voices like me to kind of take a step back and say, good luck, guys. I'm working on my film this year, you know, or whatever it is. And that has, I think, been a big sort of unsung part of our longevity is to keep that going.
How many films are submitted to Slamdance every year?
Ooh, something like 8,000 or something.
8,000?
Yeah, it's a ton. I mean, most are shorts, but you know, there's still like 2,000 features in there, and it's narratives, it's docs, it's shorts, it's international.
And it's the filmmakers from the previous year that are going through those 8,000?
Yeah, or previous years, plural. So, I mean, for example, you know, Rian Johnson was on the committee that helped choose the Russo brothers. The Russo brothers were on the committee that helped choose Chris Nolan. You know, Nolan's wife, Emma, his producing partner, Emma Thomas, you know, she was a programmer for 2 years. So a lot of people do it for more than 1 year, but yeah, it's all kind of alumni based.
Do they all still tip their hat to you over time?
Most of them do. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the Russo brothers, I mean, this is actually a big reason we're coming back to LA is because we've done events at their studio that they kind of have in downtown LA, and we're going to be doing some stuff with them next. And they write a $25,000 check to a filmmaker every year. That's one of our awards. You know, and the Nolans, we still run into them, and Ryan. And so, yeah, a lot of them have stayed involved in greater or lesser capacities, but it's also just a nice little secret society we have. It's not so secret, but you know, in LA, where it's not like the Russos will write me a check for my film. I know because I've asked them, but you know, but if I'm casting someone, you know, like when I was casting Jim Rash and Bernard and Huey, I know that he had worked on Community with them, and he'd been in one of the Marvel movies with them, and I could just text Joe on the set of Endgame Avengers or whatever, like, hey, how's Jim Rash to work with? And he very generously is like, he's great, tell him hi, you know. And that's enough to really kind of help then smooth over that process. Then, 10 minutes later, I'm meeting Jim, like, hey, Joe and Anthony say hi.
What an interesting melange, I guess it would be, of low budget indie filmmakers with people who've gone on to really super high budget big studio features.
Yeah, and I think that you've hit on something I was just talking to someone about the other day, which is that not that many people appreciate, which is this interconnectivity and between the studio system and indie film, and this kind of codependency that we have where, I was editing my first film on the Paramount lot. They gave me a free edit suite, there were a couple films where I did a couple days of sound on the Sony lot where people would just kind of sneak me in and use it. There's so many people, vendors and crew, who work studio films, most of the year, but then when they have time off, they'll work on an indie film. So I think people don't give Hollywood enough credit for being supportive of indie film in sort of not flashy ways, but in real meaningful, tangible ways.
Well, we've lost in Hollywood the studio system
Right.
actually backing lower budget, mid-budget movies. They're only backing the super high budget movies
Yeah.
and maybe television series, but
Yeah.
they're not really backing forget about independence. I'm just talking about low budget studio features.
Yeah, the $30 million rom-coms or whatever.
Those are all gone.
Gone. And forget about in the 30s and 40s when they were making the B movies. That was,
Yes, sure.
that was the independent film of that era.
But then along came Roger Corman, who recently passed,
Two departed.
and sort of changed that philosophy for a lot of people.
Exactly. Yeah. No, and he was the king of indie film, and it was an honor to have met him briefly once. But yeah, and actually at Slamdance, I just checked our program. From our very first year, our opening night film was a Corman film.
Really?
Yeah, he was the executive producer on. It was directed by a guy named John Purdy, called Reflections on a Crime. It was probably not the most Corman-esque film. It was a little bit higher quality, but the point is just in organizing that first year, we had to get his approval, and we did. We had his blessing, and then later that year, a bunch of us ran into him at a festival in France, and he was incredibly generous and supportive of us. So, between his blessing and Robert Altman, kind of blessing us at Slamdance, and then Steven Soderbergh and Richard Linklater, when those kind of figures in the industry, and then later, Ava DuVernay's been a huge supporter of Slamdance. That's really given us the confidence to say, yeah, I think we're onto something here.
So while we have a little time, tell us quickly about what is I Am Martin Eisenstat.
Oh, yeah. So that was a project I did with another Slamdance filmmaker, a guy named Eitan Gorlin, starting in 2000, I guess kind of starting in 2007. We did a series of short films, and which we were actually pitching as a TV series about a Washington-based pundit. And then as we were kind of developing the character live, we gave him a real website and a blog at the time. People in the media started to think he was real and quoted him. LA Times, Time Magazine, Fox News, MSNBC all thought he was a real Washington-based pundit and an advisor to the McCain campaign. And so we kind of played into that. And then it all kind of came to a head when there was a rumor that Sarah Palin thought Africa was a country instead of a continent, and it was blamed on a real McCain advisor who had leaked it anonymously to Fox News. So we had our character, Martin Eisenstat, take credit for being the source of that leak. And of course, that that got a lot of news. Anyway, then we outed ourselves a couple days later to the New York Times as the filmmakers behind this character, and they put it on the front page of their art section. And then the next day we got a book deal.
Wow.
We're like, book? What's a book? And but this was in fall of 2008. It was right. The economy had just collapsed. This was our little side project where we were trying to get features made. We couldn't get our next features made to save our lives. So when presented with the option, do you get paid to write a book or not get paid to not direct a movie? Your wife says, write a book. And so we did. It was a very prestigious publisher for our Strauss-Giroux, which is part of Macmillan, and we did. And the book did great. It got better reviews than any of my films. Yeah, so that was, and the book is a memoir as if this character thinks he still exists. And So it's a fun, weird meta book. That's
It's still available, I assume.
it is. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can still get it wherever fine books are sold.
Amazon, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's still there.
So I've been having this really fascinating, wonderful conversation for the last hour plus with Dan Mirvish, and we're going to wrap the show up just a little bit right now. And just wondering, in all of your experiences, can you share with us a story that's either weird, quirky, offbeat, strange, or just plain funny?
Weird. The weirdest. All my stories are weird, offbeat. Just one little thing was I said I worked on that kickboxing movie in the Philippines, and always make sure you get a return ticket when you get a job on a strange movie in the Philippines. And so I've been out there, and finally the producer said, Dan, you want to come back to LA? And I said, yes. He said, do you want to be our post supervisor? I said, great. What's a post supervisor? He said, well, you just have to find us an edit suite. Because again, this was shooting 35 millimeter film. So I tracked down a porn company called Miracle Films, and they were on like Santa Monica and Vine, and they were really sweet people. And they had an extra edit suite that we could rent. And I remember the name of the company because their motto was, it's a Miracle Films. If it's a good film, it's a miracle. And anyway, and so we rented this suite. We had a flatbed and an upright moviola. We had 3 editors working 24/7 and three assistants. And eventually the director and the producer got in their own kickboxing fight in the edit suite. It had to be broken up by two of the editors. That's how you know you're done with post-production, is when the when the director and the producer literally tearing each other's hair out. Anyway, all of which is to say that was how I learned how to make a film, was
trial by fire.
Yeah. So that was, there were a lot of people involved with that film that had worked on Corman films. Even though I never got a chance to work on a Corman film, this was about as close to a Corman film as you could get. Like, all the crew had worked, even in the Philippines, had worked on Corman films.
Well, I've long said that I love school. I think school is a great thing for a lot of people. I have all admiration for teachers in schools. But the truth is, in the film business, you're going to learn more in the first really movie that you make than maybe in all 4 years of film school if you go through undergrad.
Yeah, exactly. And, for some people, film school's the right idea. It depends what you did as an undergrad. I mean, for me, I hadn't done film as an undergrad. So for me, it made sense to go to grad school. But so many people now are getting these, pretty elaborate film degrees as undergrads, and then doesn't make sense to go to grad school. So
unless you want to teach.
Exactly. Yes. Which, strangely enough, is what I am doing a lot more of now. I just yesterday was my last class at Chapman University, where I was teaching this semester, and I'll be back there next semester as well. So
that's very nice. So last question for you today. You've already given us a huge amount of advice as we've come along throughout this show, but I'm wondering, do you have a solid piece of advice or a tip that you like to share with those who are starting out in the business, or maybe they're in a little bit trying to get to the next level?
2 words: marry well. If you can find a good partner in life, or a team of people, or if you're into that sort of thing, that will help you emotionally, financially, physically, health insurance wise, more than anything. So marry well.
Marry well. Of course, we know from society itself that doesn't always work.
No. So you should also have a backup plan, which is to know dabble in real estate.
Dabble in real estate.
Yeah, that's the dirty little secret also that I've found. Like, anyone in Hollywood or indie film, but also other art forms, like, you dig a little deeper and you realize, oh, wait, you bought your condo in 1978 and that's why you have a roof over your head. Oh, or you flip Airbnbs or houses or something. Or in our case, we rent out our house to commercials and make money off our house that way. Yeah, I always tell film students, if you take one class or one online class or course that isn't film related, learn a little something about real estate. This morning I ran into big time TV writer, showrunner, friend of ours, a neighbor, and she said, I wish we had bought a house instead of renting for the last few years. It affects people one way or the other. So
real estate. So wonderful and interesting. And as I was expecting, offbeat advice that I don't hear from anyone else, which is really, really great.
It's because it's a secret, but you scratch, believe me, every person you scratch, they will either say they did something smart in real estate or suffered because they didn't, Yeah, a roof over your head is a universal theme that everyone has to solve one way or another. So
it almost reminds me of In The Graduate when he says plastics.
Yep, exactly.
You got to have that good sideline.
Yeah.
Dan Mirvish, this has been a wonderful hour plus on StoryBeat, and I can't thank you enough for your time, your energy, and your wisdom that you shared with us today.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.